Go ahead, Polar Vortex. Scare the crap out of us.
The CSAC. My name's Sean, and I'm here representing the Committee for Systematic Help Against Regional Catastrophe, and short for SHARC, or SHARC for short. Anyways, so today we're going to be discussing about polar vortex and its effect on the East Coast. So first, let's begin by explaining what exactly is a polar vortex. So as you can see over here, polar vortex is a circulation of strong winds that typically circulate around a low pressure system, as you can see right here designated with the L. And you can think of it essentially as a hurricane of the Arctic. And typically this hurricane occurs during the winter months and it tends to stay localized in the Arctic region. However, when it becomes weakened or unstable, it can sometimes break and the cold air can actually escape down as far south as Florida. And we will actually show you a video to further illustrate what I'm trying to explain here, kind of let you see the effects of it.
It's all right, let it play. I'll do something.
Sound on your Mac. So, that's a problem.
No, it's on.
Just play it.
Play. Your sound coming on your Mac.
Yeah.
Chances are, if you hadn't heard this term before, you probably have by now.
Is it right I don't think so. I would say so.
Does anybody argue these computer things? Like 15 minutes. What means that? Just do your dance. Okay, guys. We're at 15.
Chances are, if you hadn't heard this term before, you probably have by now.
Meteorologists are calling it a polar vortex from the North Pole.
Yet another day of the polar plunge as the vortex continues to shift down to the south and east.
We're being hit by a polar vortex and thunder snow. And frankly, folks, I'm not sure if those are weather patterns or finishing moves from Mortal Kombat.
Experts say this phenomenon is kind of like a winter hurricane, basically a pattern of fast-moving winds that surround the North Pole. And that's usually where it stays. The problem arises when the vortex weakens and spills over into the south, resulting this week in some of the coldest weather parts of the country have seen in decades.
So cold that this cup of boiling water instantly freezes in midair.
Temperatures were so cold, this was the scene outside the Today Show in New York Tuesday. Of course, it's usually crawling with fans. And in Chicago, things weren't much better. Sub-zero temps in the Windy City gave birth to #Siberia. Even the polar bear at the Lincoln Park Zoo had to stay inside, and polar bears live in Siberia. Michigan and Minnesota were some of the hardest hit states, with wind chills of up to 50 degrees below zero. And that, experts say, is colder than it gets on the planet Mars. So, when will it all be over? While more than half of the country is still under a chill advisory, temps later in the week should warm up. That is, to the lower 20s and 30s. For News Team, I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn at Multiple Sources, a broader view.
Was that the January 2014 event?
Yes.
Okay.
Alright, so from that video, I hope you guys kind of got an idea of what a polar vortex is and what it can do and the frigid cold it can also bring. So there's definitely a potential for devastation to the economy if the polar vortex is to travel through and hit the major cities of the east. Sorry, we're having a little technical difficulty. Okay, so this brings us to our worst case scenario.
Day after tomorrow.
We're on it. So in a worst case scenario, a polar vortex would actually strike sometime during November during the holiday season travels, and this is a very possible time for it to occur. And if it is to hit, all the states east of the Cascades are likely to be hit as a result of this. And it will cause a deep freeze, similar to this image here you see from the movie Day After Tomorrow. And it can actually bring the temperature to as low as -50 or even -60 degrees Fahrenheit with the wind chill. And we can expect up to 6 feet of snow in a matter of a few days. And as a result of the ice and the snow, much of the transportation will actually grind to a halt. Airlines will have to be forced to ground their flights ranging anywhere from Colorado to New York. And the same is true for above ground transportation such as driving, because the roads will not be safe to drive and commute on. And to make the matters worse, it is very likely when something like this strikes, prior to this happening, when the polar vortex strikes, the local governments are likely to issue a release for students and school workers and government workers to be excused from their work. And this would, in effect, send hundreds of thousands of individuals onto the road all at once, only increasing the possibility of accidents and injuries. Oh, and actually, one more thing. Being indoors is not much better than being outdoors, because the cold will actually cause pipes to freeze and burst. And similarly, much of the power lines will be down as a result of this. So even if you're indoors, you're likely to be trapped without power, therefore without any heat source, and trapped without any fresh water to drink, and there's going to be no sewage. And it will take weeks at the fastest for that to resolve. So this leads us to our mitigation steps. These are steps that we would like to suggest to mitigate the likelihood of a worst case scenario from happening. And I think the number one step that's short term that we can implement right away is education for the public. Whenever we know a polar vortex is going to strike, it is best that the public start stocking up on food, water, and non-electric heating sources so they can stay warm and fed during this time. And also to insulate their pipes to prevent pipe breakages. And at the same time, we want to advise them not to go outside, because in the temperature of -50 to -60 degrees, simply being outside for 5 minutes is enough to cause frostbites. And so going out is definitely a no. And on the government part, we would like to see an expansion of underground transportation along with underground electricity lines power lines. Because these are the systems and infrastructure that typically are not affected by polar vortex, or, a matter of fact, a lot of different climatic disasters. And lastly, these states need to start investing more snow plows and training individuals to operate them so we can make snow removal a priority. So as you can see here, power outage is going to be a recurring theme in my presentation today. Because whenever there's a polar vortex or natural disaster, power outages are likely to happen. As you can see, starting in 2004, power outages as a result of storm, severe weather, or even cold weather has increased dramatically. And we need to mitigate this by start looking into moving the power lines underground. And the cost of moving power lines underground is, if we take a look at Washington, D.C. as a case example, to create a city-wide underground power system, it would actually cost about $1 billion, which works out to about $2,000 per mile, and it would take about 1 decade for the project to complete. While this may sound like a really high upfront cost and too big of a project for cities to handle, if you actually break down the numbers and distribute the cost to the customers, it works out to be only a $3 increase per month in their electricity bills. And once again, here's a different way to visualize the effect of a polar vortex on power outage. This is the January 2014 polar vortex. And as you can see, several states here are over 20% in their population which lost power, with New Jersey being the highest of 62%. That's more than half of the people that do not have power during this time, or a heat source for that matter. And this is unacceptable. Something needs to be done about this. And if you're still not sold on the idea of underground power lines, here's another way of looking at it. Maintenance and repair from natural disasters and just general wear and tear of above ground power lines comes to a cost of roughly $8 billion for the nation each year. Now, if these power lines are moved underground, they will be out of the weather of most of the disasters, which will actually slash the maintenance cost by half and bring it down to $4 billion each year. And here's another slide on power outage, just to drive in how important this is. Right here, this line, this is the cost for power suppliers each month, how much it is for them to generate 1 mega hour, which is typically around $50. But as you can see, during the winter months, and especially when a polar vortex strikes, that number skyrockets more than tenfold. We're looking at $50 to over $500 of cost in providing and transmitting this power source. Now, oftentimes, this is directly then distributed down to the customer, so it's the customers that are paying for this. And similarly, like the idea of bringing power lines underground, we would also like to expand the underground transportation infrastructure. So right here, we're looking at Washington, D.C. again. The teal is where the metro rails is currently underground. And we would like to expand this so entire city has underground transportation. And along with that is a superstore or a warehouse. It doesn't have to be Walmart, whatever you like, but somebody suggested Walmart would be a good choice, to be placed in the central hubs where these transits can access. So even during the time of a polar vortex, individuals that are within 5 minutes from a transit can just get to the nearest transit, take the railway, and get whatever supplies that they need without ever having to expose themselves to the weather for over 5 minutes. And like I mentioned, underground railways are safe during this time and will not be affected. So, a few more mitigation steps that we would like to look at is, first off, keeping everybody indoors because we don't want them going outside, both because of the weather that would be hard on their health, and also we don't want them driving under these conditions because it's only more likely to cause accidents and injuries and cause traffic jams where ambulance and emergency services won't be able to access them. And like I mentioned before with snowplows, clearing out the roads is a priority for certain areas in order for emergency services to access the population that are in need. And for those that are not in close proximity to a transit station to take it to the central location and pick up supplies, we want them to stay at home and we will actually deliver the supplies to them, such as food, water, heat sources, and we'll expand on that in a little bit. So this is an image of exactly what we don't want to happen. Like I mentioned, this is actually what happened in 2014 during the January polar vortex. as you can see, traffic is at a standstill. We have multiple vehicles that have gone off the road, and emergency vehicles have no way of accessing them. And several individuals actually died as a result of local government saying, hey, everybody go home now because the weather is unsafe. Had they just stayed at home, none of this would have happened, and more people would have likely have survived and reduced the damage in total collateral damage. So now let's look at the economic impact of a polar vortex. In 2014, for just 2 days, the polar vortex caused a $5 billion damage to our economy. And similarly, you can see in 2010, over 7 days, it accrued at an estimated $25 to $30 billion of damage. Now you can see this is a non-linear process where a longer duration of polar vortex will actually compound the effects and cause a larger damage to our economy. And this is just an example of how these costs can accrue so fast. So we'll look at just the snow clearance component by itself without looking at the other aspects of the economy. Once again, we're looking at DC. Each day of snow removal for the city of DC is estimated to be about $4 million. Now imagine this across the states that are east of the Cascades, east of the Rockies, and the number only goes up by each day. And now let's also look at some transportation costs that we have to face. The red line here is uncontrolled airplane cancellations, flight cancellations that occurred over the past 5 years. As you can see, the 2014 polar vortex, once again, that was the highest cause of flight cancellations. And actually, 23,000 flights were canceled as a result of this event, which amounted to roughly $150 million just from the 2 days. Well, more than 2 days, but 2 days of polar vortex. And as of right now, as of 2 days ago, 9,000 flights have already been canceled, and we're expecting something that will turn out to be larger than the 2014 polar vortex, which I will touch on at the end of this lecture, or on this slide presentation. Recovery. So we cannot completely remove the effects of a polar vortex, but what we can do is minimize the effect it has on the economy and reduce the time we need to bring the nation back to its pre-disaster conditions. So, like I mentioned before, we need to move our power lines underground. This would ensure that those within the city will have power, which translates to having heat and reducing the threat of hypothermia. Increasing underground transportation along with expansion of underground transportation. And this will allow the individuals within the city to be pretty well secured to handle a situation like this. And why that's important is because this will actually free up the military personnel that is going to come in at this time to help assist with the situation. And that will allow them to focus on road clearings, pulling cars out of the snow or snow removal, and working in conjunction with the Red Cross and Salvation Army to bring supplies to those that are either more than 5 minutes away from transit stations or those that live in rural areas and are isolated as a result of this event. Now, this leaves us to the likelihood of occurrence, and the answer is right there in the top right corner. 100% chance that this thing will happen because it is happening as we speak right now on the East Coast. And what happens is, as you can see right here, a polar vortex typically starts in the Midwest and slowly move southeast. And another problem with this is it often brings snow down to states that are not used to having snow, and they don't have the infrastructure to deal with snow. So for example, Florida, how often do they see snow down there? And in the past 3 weeks, there has already been 3 major snowstorms. And the one today is expected to be the largest of them all, lasting for over 6 days. And that is going to hit everything east of the Rocky Mountains. So now that you know how likely it is to happen, and we've gone through the damage it could cause, it is up to the government and up to CSUC to look into our mitigation proposal and invest in it so we can start minimizing the effect this polar vortex will have on our economy and future polar vortexes as well. Thank you.